The Miami sun was unforgiving, reflecting off the pristine waters outside the Harbor View restaurant, creating a picture-perfect afternoon. James Bennett only meant to grab a quick espresso after a canceled client meeting. He didn't expect to see his wife of 7 years, Madison, sitting in a secluded corner booth. He certainly didn't expect to see a strange man's hand resting intimately over hers. When James walked up and simply said her name, the blood vanished from Madison's face so fast she looked like a ghost trapped in broad daylight. "James, this is Chad, my new coworker," she stammered, her voice trembling in a way he had never heard before. But looking into Chad's cold, calculating eyes, James instantly knew two things. Chad didn't work at Ashford Media Group, and his own marriage was already over. If stories of hidden truths, shattered trust, and the heavy price of betrayal speak to you, stay with me. The air conditioning inside the Harbor View restaurant was a stark, almost violent contrast to the suffocating humidity of the Miami afternoon. James Bennett adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, welcoming the chill. His 1 o'clock client, a volatile tech entrepreneur, had canceled at the last minute, leaving James with a rare, unstructured hour in the middle of his Tuesday. He asked the hostess for a quiet table near the back, intending to catch up on some emails over a Cobb salad and a sparkling water. As he followed her through the maze of white-clothed tables and clinking crystal, his eyes swept over the dining room out of sheer habit. Then he stopped. His heart performed a strange, hollow stutter against his ribs. Sitting in a deeply recessed booth by the floor-to-ceiling windows was his wife, Madison. She was supposed to be across town, buried in the endless logistics of the Ashford Media Group merger. She had kissed him that morning, her espresso-scented breath warm against his cheek, and complained about the catered sandwiches she would be forced to eat in the boardroom. Yet here she was, wearing the emerald green silk blouse he had bought her for their anniversary, a glass of Sancerre untouched in front of her. James smiled instinctively, stepping away from the hostess to surprise her. But as the angle of his approach shifted, the heavy mahogany pillar blocking his view gave way, revealing the man sitting across from her. He was younger than James, with the kind of rugged, effortless tan that spoke of afternoons spent on yachts rather than in office chairs. He was leaning forward, invading Madison's personal space. But it wasn't the proximity that paralyzed James. It was the man's hand. It was resting entirely over Madison's, their fingers loosely tangled in a gesture of unmistakable, casual intimacy. Madison was laughing, a soft, breathless sound that James hadn't heard directed at him in months. James didn't think. He let the momentum of his sudden shock carry him forward. He didn't storm. He walked with the measured, terrifying calm of a man who had just watched his house catch fire. "Madison?" Her head snapped up. If James lived to be 100, he would never forget the way her face transformed. The vibrant flush of amusement vanished instantly, replaced by an ashen, bloodless pallor. She looked as though all the oxygen had been vacuumed from her lungs. She violently snatched her hand back, knocking her wine glass. The crystal teetered dangerously before settling, spilling a few drops of pale liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "James!" Her voice was a cracked whisper. Her eyes darted wildly, assessing the exits, assessing him, assessing the man across from her. The man, however, didn't flinch. He leaned back against the leather booth, a slow, insolent smile spreading across his face as he looked James up and down. "I thought you were in the boardroom," James said, keeping his tone perfectly level, though a roaring sound had begun to build in his ears. The meeting ended early," Madison stammered, her fingers trembling so badly she had to grip the edge of the table. She swallowed hard, the muscles in her elegant neck working in panic. "James, this is Chad. He's a new coworker at Ashford." Chad extended a hand, the same hand that had just been caressing Madison's. "Chad Hunter. Nice to finally meet you, James. Madison talks about you all the time." James stared at the offered hand for a long, agonizing second. Then he took it. The grip was firm, combative. Chad's eyes were dark, amused, and devoid of any professional deference. "A coworker," James repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked back down at Madison. She couldn't meet his gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the spilled wine, her breathing shallow and erratic. In that single agonizing moment beneath the hum of the Harbor View's elegant dining room, James knew. The foundation of his 7-year marriage hadn't just cracked, it had completely pulverized. Chad didn't work at Ashford Media Group, and Madison wasn't just having lunch. The drive home had been a masterclass in suffocating silence. Now, inside the sprawling, meticulously curated walls of their Coral Gables home, the silence had mutated into something venomous. Madison was in the kitchen, moving with a manic, jagged energy that James had never witnessed in their 7 years of marriage. She was aggressively chopping vegetables for a salad they didn't need, the rhythmic thwack of the heavy steel knife against the bamboo board sounding too loud, too desperate. "So, Chad," Madison began, her voice pitched half an octave higher than its usual smooth cadence. She didn't look up from the cutting board. "He was brought in by the Chicago office, a sort of synergy consultant for the transition. That's why we were at Harborview. Neutral territory for brainstorming. You know how toxic the office gets during a merger." James sat on a leather bar stool on the other side of the marble island, a glass of neat bourbon sweating in his grip. He watched a single drop of condensation slide down the crystal, mapping a crooked path before hitting the coaster. "Synergy consultant," James repeated. The phrase felt slick and greasy on his tongue. "I didn't realize corporate synergy required holding hands over glasses of Sancerre." The chopping stopped abruptly. Madison's shoulders stiffened under her delicate cashmere sweater. When she finally turned to face him, the bloodless pallor from the restaurant had returned, though she fought valiantly to mask it with a tight, dismissive smile. "James, please, don't make it something it isn't," she said, her tone a precarious, tightrope walk between pleading and defensive. "He was just reading my palm. It's a stupid, quirky parlor trick he does to break the ice with new executives. I swear to you," reading her palm. The lie was so juvenile, so frantically constructed on the spot, that it almost insulted his intelligence more than the betrayal itself. James took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. The liquid burned a path down his throat, a sharp, grounding contrast to the surreal, expanding numbness in his chest. He looked at his wife, the woman he had built an empire with, the mother of his 6-year-old daughter currently asleep upstairs. He searched her familiar face for a trace of the woman he knew, but all he saw was a stranger wearing a brittle mask of panic. The Madison he loved, the fiercely professional executive, wouldn't let a strange consultant touch her. The Madison he loved wouldn't stumble through a fabricated backstory with the graceless terror of a cornered animal. "A parlor trick," James said softly. He set his glass down. The clink of crystal against marble echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous kitchen. "Of course, my mistake." He watched her deflate, a microscopic sigh of relief escaping her lips as she believed she had successfully navigated the minefield. She turned back to the vegetables, the rhythm of the knife resuming, though slower this time, lacking its previous manic edge. But James wasn't retreating. He was merely digging his trenches. If he confronted her now, armed with nothing but a suspicious lunch and a flimsy excuse, she would deny it, retreat deeper into her lies, and carefully cover her tracks. He needed to know the depth of the rot before he tore down the walls of their life. He needed to know who Chad Hunter really was, because the dark, predatory look in the younger man's eyes at the restaurant belonged to a shark, not a synergy consultant. "I'm going to check on Chloe," James said, standing up. He didn't wait for her response. As he walked up the softly carpeted oak staircase, the illusion of his flawless marriage shattered completely under his heavy footsteps, leaving him utterly alone in a house built on a foundation of lies. The morning sun over the Atlantic did nothing to warm the stark interior of James's corner office. He sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, the dual monitors displaying market fluctuations he usually devoured with predatory focus. Today, the numbers were just meaningless static. The only image his brain would render was the arrogant, calculating smile of Chad Hunter, a synergy consultant. The lie tasted worse after a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, listening to the even, untroubled breathing of his wife beside him. Madison had slept. That, perhaps, was the most chilling detail of all. She had delivered a monumental lie and then drifted off into a peaceful slumber, as if the deceit was a comfortable, familiar garment she wore every day. At 10 o'clock, James picked up his phone. He scrolled past client numbers and portfolio managers until he found Brian Cooper. Brian was a senior partner at a corporate recruiting firm, a man whose entire career was built on knowing exactly who was moving where within Miami's corporate echelons, particularly at giants like Ashford Media Group. James stared at the contact name, his thumb hovering over the screen. Making this call was crossing a Rubicon. It meant taking his private nightmare and bringing a witness into it, even if under false pretenses. He took a slow, steadying breath and tapped the screen. "James, my man," Brian's voice boomed through the receiver, carrying the ambient noise of a busy coffee shop. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you're finally looking to jump ship from wealth management." "Not quite yet, Brian," James replied, forcing a lightness into his tone that felt like swallowing glass. "Actually, I'm calling about a potential new client. He pitched me yesterday, dropped some heavy names. I just wanted to verify his pedigree before I let him near our portfolios." "Smart man. Who's the rising star?" "He says he's a synergy consultant brought in by the Chicago office to handle the Ashford Media Group merger. Name is Chad Hunter." There was a pause on the line, followed by the distinct sound of Brian typing on a keyboard. James closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the edge of his desk. The silence stretched, tight and fragile as a bowstring. "Chad Hunter," Brian muttered, the typing ceasing. "You sure about the name? And the title?" "Positive." "Well, somebody is blowing smoke up your ass, James," Brian said, a note of professional disdain entering his voice. "I know the entire transition team Ashford brought down from Chicago. I placed half of them myself. There is no synergy consultant. They're using Kingsley and Partners for the restructuring, and there is absolutely no Chad Hunter on their payroll, neither in Miami nor Chicago. I'm looking at their internal directory right now. The guy is a ghost." "A ghost," the word echoed in the cavernous office. "I see," James managed to say, his voice eerily calm, devoid of the tremor that was currently violently shaking his core. "I appreciate the heads up, Brian. You just saved me a lot of headache." "Anytime. Watch your wallet with that guy. Sounds like a grifter." "I will, thanks." James ended the call and set the phone face down on the polished wood. He didn't move for a long time. The office around him felt utterly silent, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The fragile, desperate hope that Madison had somehow been telling a bizarre, clumsy truth evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. Chad Hunter was a phantom. The synergy consultant was a complete fabrication. The lunch was not a meeting. The hand over hers was not a parlor trick. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, cracking his ribs. Madison was living a double life, and the man holding her hand wasn't just a lover. He was a liar she was willing to protect with terrifying ease. James turned his chair to look out at the glittering Miami skyline, the view he had worked his entire life to secure for his family, realizing he was now staring at an empire of ash. Thursday evening descended upon Miami in a haze of oppressive humidity and flickering neon. James sat in the suffocating leather interior of his sedan, parked 2 blocks down from the Ashford Media Group building. He felt less like a respected wealth manager and more like a desperate private investigator. His tie loosened, his eyes burning from staring unblinkingly at the exit of the underground parking garage. When Madison's sleek silver Mercedes finally emerged, he gave her a block's head start before pulling into traffic. The pursuit was agonizingly mundane. She didn't weave through alleys or run red lights to lose a tail. She drove with the cautious, rigid precision of a woman carrying a fragile, highly combustible cargo. Her destination was the Sapphire Lounge, an upscale subterranean cocktail bar known for its discreet booths and heavy-handed pours of expensive scotch. James parked across the street, waiting until she disappeared down the velvet-lined stairwell. He gave her 5 minutes, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, before he followed her into the dim, violet-hued depths. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, gin, and secrets. James slipped onto a stool at the far end of the curved mahogany bar, ordering a club soda he had no intention of drinking. He kept his head down, using the mirrored backdrop of the liquor shelves to scan the room. He found them in a secluded corner booth, partially obscured by a decorative frosted glass partition. James braced himself for the physical blow of seeing them together again. He expected to witness the stolen kisses, the whispered intimacies, the intoxicating glow of an illicit romance that would officially sign the death warrant of his marriage. He was prepared for the heartbreak, but what he saw defied every agonizing scenario he had played on a loop in his head. There was no romance. Madison sat rigidly on the edge of the velvet bench, her posture defensive, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked exhausted, the ambient purple light casting hollow, bruised shadows beneath her eyes. Across from her, Chad Hunter lounged with predatory ease. He wore a dark, tailored shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man holding all the winning cards. They weren't speaking. The silence between them was heavy, transactional, and entirely devoid of affection. Then Madison reached into her oversized designer tote bag. Her movements were jerky, deeply reluctant. She pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope and slid it across the polished black table. James held his breath. From his vantage point, the envelope looked heavy, dense. Chad didn't immediately take it. He let it sit there for an agonizing moment, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips as he watched Madison squirm under his gaze. Finally, he reached out, picked up the envelope, and casually flipped open the flap. Using his thumb, he rifled through the contents. Even in the dim, colored lighting, James could recognize the distinct, banded stacks of $100 bills. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a gift. It was a payoff. Chad nodded once, a gesture of cold dismissal, and slid the envelope inside his tailored jacket. Madison closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping in a gesture of profound, defeated relief. She didn't look like a woman in the throes of passion. She looked like a hostage paying for another week of oxygen. The realization hit James with the force of a physical blow, entirely rewriting the narrative of the past 48 hours. The synergy consultant lie, the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes at the restaurant, the frantic, manic chopping of vegetables in their kitchen. This wasn't just infidelity. Chad Hunter wasn't merely a lover, he was a parasite. And Madison, the brilliant, composed woman James had built an empire with, was bleeding out in the shadows, paying a ransom for a secret she believed was worth destroying their financial future to protect. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed a sterile 2:14 a.m. In the sprawling master bedroom of their Coral Gables estate, the only sound was the rhythmic, measured breathing of Madison sleeping beside him. To James, the sound was monstrous. How could she sleep so soundly after handing over a small fortune in cash to a phantom? He slipped out from under the Egyptian cotton sheets, his bare feet sinking into the plush rug. He didn't turn on a light. He navigated the familiar geography of his home by memory and moonlight, crossing the room to Madison's expansive walk-in closet. Her oversized designer tote, the same one she had carried into the Sapphire Lounge, sat on a velvet ottoman, slouching slightly as if exhausted from the secrets it held. James stared at the black leather bag. Touching it felt like a profound violation, a crossing of a boundary he could never uncross. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was actively breaking into the privacy of his wife's life. But the image of that thick manila envelope sliding across the table was burned into his retinas. He reached out and unclasped the gold hardware. He moved with surgical precision, his senses hyper-tuned to any shift in the breathing coming from the bedroom. He sifted through the mundane debris of her life, a tortoiseshell hair clip, 3 different shades of expensive lipstick, half-empty mints, and embossed client folders. Nothing incriminating. He checked the side pockets. Empty. Frustration tightened his jaw. Was he losing his mind? Had she already disposed of whatever leverage Chad held over her? His fingers brushed against the bottom edge of the bag's interior. There was a slight, unnatural rigidity near the seam, a hidden zippered compartment sewn so flush into the dark silk lining it was nearly invisible. James held his breath, hooked his fingernail under the minuscule zipper pull, and eased it open. The metallic rasp sounded like a scream in the quiet house. He reached inside and his fingers closed around cold, heavy metal. He pulled it out into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the plantation shutters. It was an unmarked brass key. It didn't belong to their house, their luxury cars, or the high-tech security doors of the Ashford Media Group building. It was a generic, cheaply cut piece of hardware, the kind used for rundown apartments or storage units. It was the physical key to her hidden life. James weighed the jagged piece of brass in his palm. If he took it, Madison would panic the moment she realized it was missing, alerting Chad that their twisted arrangement was compromised. He needed the access, but he couldn't leave a footprint. Moving silently, James stepped into the master bathroom and closed the heavy oak door until only a crack remained. He located a thick, unused decorative pillar candle resting on the edge of the marble-soaking tub. Lighting a match from the vanity drawer, he carefully melted a small pool of wax onto a glass coaster. Before it could harden, he pressed the brass key firmly into the soft, warm wax, ensuring every groove and jagged tooth left a perfect, precise indentation. He waited an agonizing minute for the mold to set, then gently peeled the key away. The wax held the exact negative of Madison's secret. He wiped the key clean on a towel and crept back into the closet, returning it to the hidden pocket and zipping it shut. As he stood there in the dark, staring at the wax impression in his hand, a bitter reality washed over him. He was a wealthy, successful man who provided everything his family could ever want. Yet his wife was renting space in the shadows. He didn't just have a cheating wife. He had a wife who was a stranger, and soon he was going to find out exactly what this stranger was unlocking. The pungent smell of hot brass and machine oil hung heavy in the cramped Little Havana locksmith shop. James stood near a rattling, oscillating fan, watching an elderly man in a stained Guayabera shirt work the noisy grinder. It had cost James $300 in cash to persuade the man to cut a key from a wax mold with zero questions asked. When the fresh, jagged piece of metal was finally placed in his palm, it felt heavier than it looked. It was a tangible, biting piece of his wife's deception, but a key was entirely useless without a door. Sitting in his parked car down the block, James opened his laptop. He didn't need to hire a private investigator. He just needed to exploit the luxury ecosystem he himself had built and paid for. Madison drove a top-tier Mercedes, an anniversary gift fully integrated into their centralized family account. He accessed the cloud-based GPS history, bypassing the primary mundane routes between their Coral Gables estate, the Ashford Media Group tower, and their daughter's school. He looked for the anomalies, the dark spots on the map. It took less than 20 minutes to find a recurring pin drop. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 2 months, the silver Mercedes had idled for exactly 1 hour at an address in Hialeah. It was a dense, industrial-adjacent neighborhood, miles away from the polished veneer of their usual social circles, a place where a $100,000 car stood out like a distress flare. James drove there the following afternoon. The transition from the manicured, palm-lined avenues of his neighborhood to the cracked, sun-baked concrete of Hialeah was a jarring descent. The address belonged to a sprawling, dilapidated complex mockingly named the Azure Oasis. There was no azure and certainly no oasis. It was a brutalist block of faded stucco, chain-link fences, and rusting window AC units dripping condensation onto the pavement below. He parked a block away, leaving his tailored suit jacket on the passenger seat to blend in slightly better, and walked toward the complex. The heat was suffocating, thick with the smell of exhaust and stale rain. He navigated the exterior breezeways, his heart pounding a slow, heavy, relentless rhythm against his ribs. The GPS data had pinpointed the eastern wing. He climbed a set of rusted metal stairs to the second floor. The doors here were cheap, hollow core wood, painted a peeling, institutional beige. He walked down the corridor, gripping the brass key in his pocket so tightly the metal teeth bit into his skin. He stopped in front of Unit 214. There was no welcome mat, no decorative wreath. The glass of the peephole was smudged and opaque with grime. This was not a romantic love nest. A woman like Madison, who agonized over the thread count of their Egyptian cotton sheets and the specific vintage of their dinner wine, would never bring a passionate affair to a place that smelled of damp rot and cheap bleach. This was a hiding place, a bunker, a transaction point. Looking over his shoulder to ensure the concrete breezeway was entirely empty, James slid the freshly cut brass key into the deadbolt. For a terrifying, breathless second, it resisted. Then with a firm, deliberate push, the interior tumblers aligned. The lock gave a heavy, satisfying metallic click. The door was unlocked. He only needed to turn the handle and step into the abyss of his wife's second life. His hand hovered over the cheap brass knob, his pulse deafening in his ears. But he stopped. If Chad Hunter was inside, James was unarmed and completely unprepared. If he went in now, blind, he might trigger an explosion he couldn't control. He needed to know exactly what Madison had traded her soul for before he faced the devil in his own den. James carefully turned the key back, locking the door. He pulled the brass loose, pocketed it, and walked away from Unit 214, leaving the shadows undisturbed for one more day. Café Lumière was an exercise in curated Parisian elegance, a place where Miami's elite gathered to sip overpriced cortados and pretend they weren't sweating through their linen suits. James found Rachel Green precisely where her Instagram stories placed her every Friday afternoon, tucked into a velvet corner booth, surrounded by fabric swatches and architectural blueprints. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pulled out the bistro chair opposite her and sat down. Rachel blinked, her manicured hand freezing halfway to her mouth with a porcelain cup. "James, what on earth? Is everything okay? Is Madison with you?" "Madison is at the office," James said, his voice flat, devoid of the warm, brotherly affection he usually reserved for his wife's closest friend. "And no, Rachel, nothing is okay." He watched her carefully. Rachel was a sharp, perceptive woman, but under James's unblinking predatory gaze, she immediately faltered. She set the cup down, the porcelain rattling violently against the saucer. "I don't understand. What's going on?" she asked, attempting a mask of innocent concern that was painfully unconvincing. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." James leaned forward, invading her space, dropping his voice to a low, serrated whisper. "I know about Chad Hunter. I know about the cash she handed him at the Sapphire Lounge. And I know about the apartment in Hialeah." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. All the artificial composure bled out of Rachel's face. She looked as if the elegant floor of Café Lumière had simply vanished beneath her feet. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, choked sound emerged. She glanced frantically around the bustling cafe, suddenly terrified of who might be watching. "James, please," she finally whispered, her eyes shining with sudden, unshed tears. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me," James demanded, the ice in his tone hardening. "Because right now, I'm watching my wife bleed our joint accounts to pay off a phantom in a slum. So either you tell me exactly what she has gotten herself into, or my next stop is the police precinct to report an extortion ring, and I will make sure they know you were an accessory to hiding it." It was a bluff, but a highly calculated one. Rachel broke. She buried her face in her hands, a ragged sob escaping her throat. "She didn't tell me everything," Rachel cried quietly into her palms. "I swear to God, James, I don't know the whole truth. But she's terrified. She's completely terrified." "Terrified of what? Exposing an affair?" The word tasted like poison, but he forced himself to say it. Rachel lowered her hands, her mascara smudged, looking at him with a mixture of profound pity and raw fear. "It was supposed to be a mistake, a stupid, meaningless mistake at a conference in Chicago 6 months ago. She was stressed. She had too much to drink. She swore it meant nothing. But then he followed her here." James felt the air thin in his lungs. Chicago, 6 months ago. The timeline aligned sickeningly well with Madison's sudden shift in mood, her late nights, her erratic anxiety. "She tried to cut it off," Rachel continued, her voice trembling. "But Chad, he's not normal, James. He laughed at her. He told her he had recordings, videos from the hotel room. He said if she didn't pay him exactly what he asked for, he would send everything to you, to her boss, to the board at Ashford Media. He said he would make sure she lost her daughter and her career in the exact same hour." The pieces of the grotesque puzzle finally slammed together. The sheer terror at Harborview Restaurant, the thick manila envelope of cash, the cheap brass key. Madison wasn't paying for a lover's silence. She was paying a ransom on her own life. "How much?" Henry James asked, his voice eerily calm, the emotional devastation temporarily overridden by a chilling, absolute clarity. "How much has she given him?" "I don't know," Rachel wept. "Tens of thousands, maybe more. She said he keeps raising the price. James, you have to help her. He's destroying her. James stood up slowly, looking down at the weeping woman who had helped conceal the destruction of his marriage. The betrayal was an open wound, but a colder, sharper realization had taken root in his mind. Madison had invited a predator into their lives, and James was the only one who could hunt him down. "Don't call her," James said softly. "If you breathe a word of this conversation to Madison, I promise you I will burn everything down myself." The drive back to Hialeah was a blur of asphalt and adrenaline. When James finally stood before the peeling beige door of Unit 214, he didn't hesitate. He slid the brass key into the deadbolt, turned it, and pushed the door open. He stepped into a sensory void. The apartment smelled of stale coffee, cheap bleach, and stagnant air. The blinds were drawn tight, blocking out the aggressive Miami sun and casting the living room in a bruised amber twilight. If a small, naive part of James had still expected to find the remnants of a passionate love affair, a discarded silk scarf, empty wine bottles, the lingering scent of Madison's expensive perfume, that illusion was instantly annihilated. The space was brutally Spartan. A faux leather sofa faced a blank wall. In the corner sat a cheap laminated desk holding a sleek black laptop and a stack of external hard drives. This was not a love nest. It was an office, a slaughterhouse where reputations were butchered and banked. James locked the door behind him and approached the desk. The laptop was asleep but not powered down. He tapped the space bar. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the dim air. To his dark amusement, there was no password prompt. Arrogance was often a criminal's greatest vulnerability. The desktop was meticulously organized. James clicked on a folder labeled Active Accounts. A spreadsheet opened, and the air in the suffocating apartment suddenly felt ice cold in James's lungs. He stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the sheer, mechanical scale of the devastation before him. Madison was not a tragic anomaly. She was merely a row on a spreadsheet. Column A listed initials. M.B. Ashford was right in the middle. Beside her name were dates spanning the last 6 months, corresponding with the massive cash withdrawals James had yet to discover in their joint accounts. Next to the dates were chillingly clinical notes. Chicago leverage applied. Initial payout secured. Escalation phase 3 active. But it was the names above and below Madison's that paralyzed him. S.C. Whitmore Capital. A.F. Sterling and Associates. V.S. Pemberton Tech. There were dozens of them. Next to each name were staggering dollar amounts, dates of affairs initiated at various corporate conferences, and links to subfolders containing the extortion material. Chad Hunter was not a younger man who had stumbled into an intoxicating mistake with a married executive. He was a professional predator. He hunted high-net-worth, high-status women, seduced them in moments of fabricated vulnerability, recorded the encounters, and bled them dry. The affair in Chicago wasn't a lapse in Madison's judgment. It was a targeted, perfectly executed trap. James clicked open the subfolder marked MB. His hand shook violently on the trackpad. He saw thumbnail images, still frames captured from a hidden camera in a sterile hotel room. He didn't open them. He couldn't. The betrayal still burned like acid in his veins, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a towering, white-hot rage directed at the man who had orchestrated it. Madison had lied to him. She had betrayed their vows, but she had been hunted. He found a blank flash drive in the desk drawer, plugged it into the laptop, and began dragging every folder, every spreadsheet, and every vile piece of leverage into the drive. The progress bar crawled across the screen, agonizingly slow. The silence of the apartment pressed in on him, broken only by the hum of the hard drive and his own shallow breathing. He was standing in the center of a criminal enterprise, holding the detonator to dozens of ruined lives. As the copying completed and he slipped the flash drive into his pocket, James heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel parking lot below, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of footsteps echoing up the concrete stairs. They were here. The heavy footsteps stopped just outside Unit 214. The metallic scrape of a key sliding into the deadbolt echoed through the stifling apartment. James did not scramble for a hiding place. He simply stepped back into the narrow shadowed hallway leading to the bathroom, letting the ambient gloom of the drawn blinds conceal his silhouette, The door swung inward, bringing with it a rush of humid afternoon air. Chad entered first, moving with the arrogant, loose-limbed stride of a man who owned the space and everything in it. Madison followed a second later. She looked small, her posture curled inward, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a useless shield. "You're light, Madison. 5 grand short," Chad said, his voice a lazy drawl as he tossed his keys onto the laminate desk. He didn't even look at her. "I couldn't get more without raising flags," Madison pleaded, her tone frantic, stripped of all her usual corporate authority. "James monitors the primary accounts. I had to pull cash from different ATMs over 3 days just to get this much. You have to give me more time." "I don't care about James, and I certainly don't care about your banking logistics," Chad sneered, turning to face her. "I care about the timeline. We agreed on a schedule in Chicago. You deviate, the price goes up." James stepped out of the shadows. "Then let's discuss the new price, Chad." The effect was cataclysmic. Madison gasped, a sharp, ragged sound of pure terror, and her handbag slipped from her grasp, hitting the cheap linoleum floor with a heavy thud. She stumbled back against the doorframe, her eyes wide, the blood draining from her face so completely she looked like a corpse. Chad spun around, his predatory smirk vanishing instantly. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock registered in his dark eyes before he masked it with aggressive bravado. "Well, well, the husband," Chad said, shifting his weight, his hands balling into fists. "Did you follow her here to watch, buddy? A little voyeurism to spice up the marriage?" James ignored the bait. He felt no urge to shout, no impulse to throw a punch. The white-hot rage that had consumed him minutes ago had crystallized into something cold, surgical, and utterly ruthless. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, placing himself between Chad and the door. "I didn't come to watch," James replied, his voice deadly quiet. "I came to do an audit, and your bookkeeping is remarkably thorough." Chad's gaze flicked involuntarily toward the laptop on the desk, then back to James. The bravado began to fracture. "MBSCAF," James recited smoothly, watching the younger man's jaw clench. "A very lucrative portfolio you manage here. Extortion is a high-margin business, provided your victims remain paralyzed by shame. Unfortunately for your bottom line, my wife's account is officially closed." Madison covered her face with her trembling hands, sliding slowly down the doorframe until she hit the floor. The sound of her muffled, agonizing sobs filled the sterile room. Her secret was out, stripped of all its protective layers, exposed in the ugliest light possible. "You think you can just walk in here and take over?" Chad took a menacing step forward, dropping the casual facade. "If I hit send on those files, her career is over. Her reputation is ashes. You'll be the laughingstock of Coral Gables by dinner time." James reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out the silver flash drive, holding it up to catch the dim amber light. "You can't hit send on anything," James stated, his tone carrying the absolute crushing weight of a corporate executioner. "I have your entire directory right here. Every file, every video, every financial transaction tracing back to Chicago. You send one frame of my wife to anyone, and this drive goes directly to the FBI's cybercrime division. You are not just a homewrecker. You are a serial extortionist operating across state lines. That is a federal offense, Chad. They will bury you so deep under a federal penitentiary, you will forget what the sun looks like." The room fell into a suffocating, terrifying silence. Chad stared at the small silver device in James's hand, the reality of his own trap finally closing in around him. Chad's eyes darted from the silver flash drive in James's hand to the unyielding, surgical coldness in the older man's gaze. The arrogant predator who had lounged in the Sapphire Lounge was gone, replaced instantly by a cornered animal rapidly calculating his own survival. He knew James wasn't bluffing. A man who could quietly infiltrate this apartment, bypass the lock, and clone a hard drive wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger on an FBI tip. "Keep it," Chad spat, his voice losing its smooth cadence, cracking with a sudden, venomous panic. He snatched his car keys off the laminate desk, making the split-second decision to abandon the laptop and the remaining data. "She's damaged goods anyway, Bennett. You two deserve each other." He didn't look back. Chad shoved past the doorframe, his heavy footsteps retreating down the concrete breezeway with frantic, undisciplined speed. A moment later, the violent screech of tires echoed from the gravel lot below, fading quickly into the oppressive Miami heat. The immediate threat was gone. The silence that rushed in to fill the vacuum in Unit 214 was deafening, heavier than the humid air pressing against the drawn blinds. James slowly lowered his hand, his fingers closing tightly around the small metal drive that held the blueprint of his wife's ruin. He looked down. Madison was still slumped against the wall by the door, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her expensive emerald silk blouse was wrinkled and stained with tears. The brilliant, formidable executive of Ashford Media Group had been reduced to a trembling, hollow shell on a cheap linoleum floor. "James," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, a pathetic, scraping sound in the quiet room. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry." He didn't move to comfort her. He felt no urge to kneel beside her or offer a reassuring touch. Instead, he felt a profound, terrifying emptiness where his love and respect for her used to reside. The adrenaline that had fueled his investigation for the past 48 hours was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, crushing exhaustion. "Chicago," James said, the word falling flat and heavy between them. "6 months ago." Madison nodded frantically, her face buried in her trembling hands. "It was the final night of the merger conference. I was exhausted. I was so terrified of losing the promotion to the Chicago team. He was at the hotel bar. He was just listening to me vent. I had 3 martinis, James. 3. I swear to God, I barely remember walking to the elevator. But he was there. And then I woke up in his room." She gasped for air, the confession tearing out of her like jagged pieces of glass. "I left before he even woke up. I thought it was just a horrible, disgusting mistake. I thought I could bury it and move on. But a week later, he showed up in the lobby of my building. He had a tablet, James. He showed me the video. He had set up a camera before we even got to the room." James stared at the peeling beige paint on the opposite wall. He didn't want to see the images forming in his mind. He didn't want to imagine the man who had just fled this room touching his wife, manipulating her into a trap she was too blinded by ambition and alcohol to see. "So you paid him," James stated, mechanically piecing together the financial hemorrhaging he had yet to fully audit in their joint accounts. "He asked for $10,000 first," she wept, looking up at him with red, swollen eyes, her mascara running in dark tracks down her pale cheeks. "He said it was a one-time fee to delete the files. I pulled it from my personal bonus account. But then it was 20, then 50. He said if I didn't keep paying, he would send the link to you, to Chloe's school, to the board of directors. He said he would make sure Chloe grew up knowing exactly what her mother was. I couldn't let him destroy her, James. I couldn't." "So you destroyed us instead," James replied, his voice devoid of any heat, delivering a chilling, absolute verdict. "You let a criminal drain our accounts and dictate our lives because you were too cowardly to tell me the truth." Madison let out a ragged sob, burying her face in her knees once more. There was no defense left to mount. The truth was finally out, stripped bare in the sterile, airless apartment, and it was far uglier than a simple affair. It was a monument of lies, built on a foundation of betrayal, and its collapse had finally crushed them both. James stood in the center of Unit 214, the stale air heavy with the scent of cheap bleach and shattered illusions. He looked down at Madison, who was still weeping silently on the cracked linoleum. He didn't feel the fiery, righteous anger of a wronged husband anymore. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the confrontation was gone, leaving in its wake a profound, cavernous exhaustion. He walked over to the laminate desk, unplugged the laptop, and shoved it into his leather briefcase along with the external hard drives. He was not going to leave Chad any digital remnants to crawl back to. He would destroy the hardware himself, ensuring the poison could never leak into the public domain. "Get up," James said. His voice was flat, entirely devoid of malice, but equally devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man speaking to a stranger. Madison flinched as if struck. She slowly pushed herself off the floor, her legs trembling beneath the ruined silk of her skirt. She couldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on the tips of her designer shoes. "We are leaving," James told her. turning his back and walking out into the suffocating Hialeah heat. He didn't check to see if she was following. He knew she was. She had nowhere else to go. The drive back to Coral Gables was a masterclass in psychological torture. They took separate cars. James watched her silver Mercedes in his rearview mirror, navigating the aggressive Miami traffic with a slow, mechanical caution. Yesterday, he had followed that car with a heart full of burning suspicion. Today, he led it with a heart entirely turned to ash. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers tracing the cold, sharp edges of the silver flash drive. The duality of his reality threatened to crush his chest. On one hand, the woman driving behind him was a victim of a vicious, calculated crime. Chad had hunted her, exploited a moment of drunken vulnerability in Chicago, and subjected her to months of agonizing psychological torment. James felt a flicker of innate human pity for the sheer, suffocating terror she had endured alone in the dark. But then, the other hand closed its iron grip around his throat. She was alone because she chose to be. She chose to drink with a stranger at a hotel bar. She chose to go to his room. And most devastatingly, she chose to build a fortress of lies rather than come to her husband for help. She had looked James in the eye every morning, kissed their daughter goodbye, and then driven to a slum to pay a ransom with their family's future. The betrayal wasn't just the infidelity, it was the absolute catastrophic lack of trust. She had viewed James not as a partner to fight beside, but as a liability to manage. When they finally pulled into the wide, paver-stone driveway of their estate, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bleeding shadows across the manicured lawn. The house looked exactly as it had that morning, a monument to their success, a flawless architectural shell holding nothing but empty space. James killed the engine but didn't get out immediately. He watched Madison step out of her Mercedes. She looked frail, standing in the driveway, staring at the front door of her own home as if it belonged to someone else. He stepped out of his car and walked past her, his footsteps heavy on the stone. "James," she whispered, her voice fracturing in the evening air. "What do we do now?" He stopped on the porch, his hand resting on the brass handle of the heavy oak door. He looked back at her, taking in the tear-streaked face of the woman he had loved for a decade. "I'm going to call a forensic accountant in the morning to assess the financial hemorrhage," James said quietly, the finality in his tone absolute. "Then I am going to pack a bag for the guest room. You will explain to Chloe that Daddy has to work late for a while. And then, Madison, we are going to figure out how to dismantle this life without breaking our daughter." He opened the door and walked inside, leaving her standing alone in the fading light. 7 months had passed since the afternoon the suffocating air of Hialeah had choked the remaining life out of their marriage. The corner conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown Miami law firm offered a sterile, climate-controlled sanctuary, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional wreckage that had brought them to this heavy mahogany table. James sat on one side, wearing a charcoal suit that hung slightly looser on his frame than it had half a year ago. Across from him sat Madison. The vibrant, fiercely confident executive of Ashford Media Group was gone, replaced by a quiet, diminished version of the woman he had married. She wore a simple, unadorned beige blouse, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed entirely on the thick stack of legal documents resting in the center of the table. The forensic audit had been a brutal autopsy. Chad Hunter's extortion had carved a massive, bleeding crater into their joint savings and investment portfolios. James had personally overseen the quiet, permanent destruction of the hardware he took from Unit 214, smashing the hard drives into physical dust to ensure the poison could never reach their daughter, Chloe. Chad had vanished, likely hunting new prey in another state, but the ghost he left behind had successfully haunted the Bennett house until the structural walls finally collapsed. Their respective attorneys, two sharp-suited professionals who traded in the daily currency of broken families, murmured quiet legal jargon. James tuned them out. He looked at Madison. The white-hot anger that had once threatened to consume his sanity had long since burned out, leaving only a vast, echoing landscape of bittersweet acceptance. They had protected Chloe. That was their only remaining shared victory. They had navigated the agonizing process of separating their lives with a cold, mechanical precision, shielding their daughter from the grotesque reality of the blackmail. To Chloe, it was just a sad, amicable split. To James and Madison, it was a daily funeral. If you could both sign here and initial the bottom of page 42, Madison's attorney instructed softly, sliding a heavy silver pen across the polished wood. Madison picked up the pen. Her hand, the same hand James had seen tangled with a predator's at the Harbor View restaurant, hovered over the signature line. The silence in the room stretched, thick and absolute. James watched her chest rise and fall with a shallow, jagged breath. She pressed the nib to the paper. As she traced the letters of her married name for the final time, a single heavy tear broke free from her lashes. It fell with a quiet tap, landing directly on the thick parchment. The salt water hit the fresh ink of her signature, causing the dark blue edge of the B in Bennett to feather and smudge outward, a permanent, physical stain on the legal death certificate of their marriage. She didn't wipe her face. She simply slid the document across the table to James. He took the pen. The metal felt cold against his skin. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name next to hers, the stroke sharp and definitive, severing the final thread of a decade of shared history. The attorneys collected the paperwork, whispered their practiced condolences, and tactfully stepped out of the room to process the copies, leaving James and Madison completely alone in the echoing silence. Madison kept her eyes lowered, staring at the empty space on the mahogany table where the papers had been. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice fragile, sounding like an echo from a distant, unreachable past. I thought by paying him, keeping it hidden, I was protecting us." James stood up and slowly buttoned his suit jacket. He looked down at the woman who had been his partner, his confidant, and ultimately, the architect of their ruin. He felt a profound tragedy in the physical space between them, the tragic beauty of an ending that was entirely necessary, yet fundamentally heartbreaking. "I know you did," James replied quietly, his tone carrying the unyielding weight of their new reality. He picked up his leather briefcase, the faint memory of the little Havana locksmith shop and the amber twilight of Unit 214 flashing briefly in his mind. He turned toward the heavy glass door, pausing for a fraction of a second before stepping out into the hallway. "We survived the truth, Madison," he said, the words hanging in the chilled air of the room. "But we didn't survive the lies."